everybody know that we're going to be recording this session today to capture the amazing work and ideation of these presenters today. So if you're not comfortable with that, please mute or put yourself on video or watch the video later, but just wanting to make sure that everyone knows and is aware. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. I also wanted to start off by acknowledging some of the events of today. Fashion Revolution USA, we celebrate the significance of the news of the Derek Chauvin's conviction. As a person who is currently a resident of Minneapolis, I am just recognizing that there's a lot more work to be done to create a more just and sustainable world for all, and especially for our Black community members here in Minnesota, where I live, across the US and around the world. And so just sitting with that today. I also want to acknowledge that our community, my community, stands on Minnesota Mejote, the homelands of the Lakota. I honor the waters that they have stewarded here for time immemorial, and we as Fashion Revolution USA are still learning and pushing ourselves to do better to support our Indigenous communities. But we're continuing our journey here today. Encourage you all to also learn about the importance of land acknowledgements and what territories you reside in. And so I will just pop in the chat some information to get you started and to get you familiar with Fashion Revolution USA and some of our work today. So thank you again. I am really honored to be here and to hand over the conversation today to Joelle, who will be our moderator and our lead for the day. We have a beautiful visual presentation, so panelists, presenters, please let us know when you're ready to go to the next slide. We're here to support you, and we will hand it over to Joelle. So if we could go to the next slide, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ashleen and Mackenzie and the whole team for putting this together. It's an honor for me to be here and to be surrounded by an amazing speakers. So welcome everyone. And I don't want to take any more time because we have a lot to unpack in this very important conversation. So as Ashleen said, it's going to be, there's going to be a slide and presentation and then a little discussion. So if we can first have all our panelists introduce themselves, and we can start with you, Eugenia, please. I think you're on mute. If you can unmute.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm delighted to be with you today. So my name is Eugenia Paulicelli. I'm a professor of Italian Studies, Women's Studies and Comparative Literature at Queen's College and the Graduate Center, the City University of New York, where I have founded and direct a concentration in fashion studies. I was born in Italy, as you might detect from my accent, and came to this country to do my PhD, and I stayed. And so during this ongoing process of negotiation of identity, languages, and translation, I've been able to pursue my passion, which is the study of fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia, for being with us. Brenda, would you go next?
Hi, my name is Brenda Equihua, and I'm the owner and designer of Equihua. We're an LA-based fashion brand, creating amazing garments and trying to incorporate this idea of mysticism and magic into everything that we make.
Thank you, Brenda, for being with us. Darnell, please.
Hi, thank you again for inviting me, and thank you to all the organizers for having us here. But my name is Darnell Jamal Lisby. I am a fashion historian and curator based here in New York City. And I've been around the block doing a few different things, but primarily my research delves into understanding the impact of Blackness in the Afro diaspora on the history of fashion, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries. Recently, which I'll talk about in my portion of the presentation a little bit, we welcome you to come to an exhibition that I helped recently curate, which is Willie Smith Street Culture here at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, where the museum opens this summer, hopefully. So thank you all again.
That's exciting. Hopefully we can all make it. Manpreet?
Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here with such an awesome panel. My name is Manpreet Kalra. I am a social impact advisor, educator, and podcast host, working on decolonizing storytelling in the ethical, sustainable landscape. Most of my work is focused around the intersection of impact communication and global development, and appropriation falls right into that. So I'm really looking forward to sharing space with all of you.
Thank you, Manpreet. We're so excited to have you all here. My name is Joelle Fearsley. I'm a fashion researcher and the CEO of Tribute, which is a multidisciplinary space and responsible retail based in Washington, DC. So I want to start first with a simple yet complex question. It's a question of definition. So I want to know what is culture? How do we define culture today? And Eugenia, we can start with you. If you can unmute yourself.
Thanks. I thought actually to combine this with the next question.
Yes, and it makes total sense. Yeah.
You know, I also because of some of my remarks later on in the second part, they deal very much with the notion of culture. So if it's okay with you, otherwise I'll pass over. Is it okay?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay, I would like to start so with this the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, the way define cultural appropriation. And so is the acknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the practices, customs, or aesthetics of one social or ethnic group by members of another, typically dominant community or society. So in addition, the dictionary provides several instances showing how this process has been practiced by Euro-Western dominating forces to exploit indigenous or native cultures. We know, however, that definition and boundaries in our globalized networked world are porous and precarious. And this is really some of the point I would like to address in my presentation. So I could stop here. So on this idea of boundaries, precariousness, and notions of definitions, and then I'll pick up again after my other speakers have talked.
Perfect. Yes, it's just to have an idea of how do you define for all of you, and then we can dig deeper into your presentation.
Still, it's not this my definition. I just quoted because I want to pick up again some of the issues later.
Yes. Anyone wants to add something?
I'll jump in here. I think that you know, the thing about culture is it's about collective. It's about community. It's about the shared identity and the shared experience that you have with others. And culture is part and parcel to the preservation of these identities and communities. And I think a lot about culture and cultural preservation because I think it intersects with language. It intersects with rituals. It intersects with how you see each other. It intersects with humanity. And I think for me, when I think about culture, I think about all those layers that play into how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we see our communities.
Yes, right. Brenda, Darnell, if you want to add something.
And even to add on top of that, specifically with the research that a lot of the research that I do, it's really almost a form of communication, within a community and externally, how that community really kind of positions itself within the entire world. What mark are they leaving? How are they, to Manpreet's point, how are they seeing themselves and viewing themselves? That culture really is a vehicle for the survival of that community. And so I think that when we get into these kind of conversations about cultural appropriation, and what I'll of course show within my segment, there's a spectrum. It's a very gray area subject that's not necessarily, well, in some instances, I think we can claim, this is that, and this, one is on one end and one is on the other. But then in terms of fashion specifically, it gets into a lot of gray areas, particularly because there's that question of what's inspiration and what's appropriation. How do we kind of grapple with those things in terms of the social aspects of that are so ingrained within a particular community? So,
and I know you will elaborate more on this subject. Brenda, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that, yeah, it's pretty much a combination of rituals and traditions and things that unite, or actions that unite a group of people. And it ranges outside, I mean, because culture can be, Mexican culture, or it can be sneaker culture. So it has dimensions, and it's very, very layered. But for the most part, I feel like it's a uniting force within a group of people.
I can't wait to dig deeper. So to start off, Eugenia, you are an expert in fashion theory and fashion history, and a lot of your research has centered around how fashion functions as an industry and as a symbolic force mediated across time and space. You also created the Fabric of Cultures, a research and pedagogical lab that aims at a deeper understanding of fashion and local and global clothing as powerful manifestation of human and aesthetic expression. So the floor is yours. We want to know more about your research and your finding, and what is cultural appropriation and how does that work? Unmute, Eugenia.
All this game of so in any case, no, thank you, Joelle, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to read some of my thoughts here, and then show some slides about the Fabric of Cultures project, just to frame kind of the what I mean, and I think this very gray area and very complex. So we said that definition and boundaries in our network and globalized society are very porous and precarious. So the porosity of these boundaries act as an invitation to explore alternative paradigms that challenge the status quo. In fact, the narrative of, let's say, cultural appropriation, when it is complemented by the justification of cultural appreciation, risks reproposing and even perpetuating a binarism that is ideologically conservative and ultimately wrong. Cultural appropriation rests on the presupposition of a dominant culture and a subordinate one, the West and the rest. It is a paradigm that sees European and Western civilizations seen as compact, utopian entities or nation states as modern and superior, and other cultures as traditional, backward, subordinated, etc. So a rich bibliography has posed and problematized questions about collective and individual identity, the narrative of modernity, the idea of the nation and Europe in relation to other civilizations that during the first stages of colonialism, Europeans were in the process of discovering, the relationship between fashion and material culture on the one hand, and on the other, race, and the clash between European and indigenous cultures. A new language, I think, is needed to construct a narrative that would allow us to really know and understand other cultures, their history, and in the field of fashion, their craft and design traditions, or to understand otherness as an integral component of identity. The other or otherness in general reside within our own self, not only outside or located in foreign unfamiliar bodies. From this perspective, fashion is a powerful and unique tool insofar as it offers a concrete, a tangible example that becomes indispensable to both approach and challenge larger ethical and political questions at the core of our globalized world and the complex implications of identity constructs. The fashion industry as a whole, practitioners, designers, image makers, consumers have an opportunity to challenge the status quo. Such a revolutionary and paradigmatic shift involves a commitment to redirect the narrative, the vocabulary, and the language we use so as to avoid obfuscating the real danger of racial capitalism's tendency to annihilate difference and claim that there is a purity or an origin. Against this background, the concept of translation, and this is really my point, specifically the translating of cultures, may be of assistance. I would like to propose a reflection that can embrace different domains, such as translation studies, fashion studies. A thread that unites us is fashion, dress, and textile. They build and weave culture in bodies and communities. They are culture. Fashion is culture. For literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, and I quote, language for the individual consciousness lies on the borderline between oneself and the other. The word in language is half of someone else. The word becomes one's own through an act of appropriation, which means that it's never fully one's own, always permeated with traces of other words, other users. These mechanisms are also foundational for fashion. The term translation derives from the Latin translatus, the past participle of transferre, which means carrying across. In its etymology, translation evokes and engenders movement, mobility, migration. It is a process that crosses borders and enables the negotiating of cultural differences. This process is especially important for racialized bodies and identities, which have either been excluded from or rendered invisible by the master narrative of history and modernity. And these are the kind of premises to just show a few slides, of one aspect of the fabric of culture. I don't know if you want to please show the slides. There is a website this was, I started this project in the early 2000s when I was designing courses on the culture of fashion in programs that were not for fashion, but just, you know, a course in literary studies, in cultural studies. And so I integrated the study of fashion within a wider context. And then I discovered that in my college, Queen's College, they have a rich collection of textile and costume and fashion. And so the idea was to bring together people with different, you know, disciplines, students, because at Queen's College, we have a student body that is very, very diverse. In fact, Queen's has been defined as the most diverse borough of the United States. And so it was kind of a collective idea to bring fashion to the fore and study fashion as culture, and to see how important it is to study in order to interrogate identity, in order to interrogate the borders. And in fact, one of the central, I have some slides here that you see here, is a designer who's been quite an inspiration in then and also in the second inception of an exhibition and project in 2017, Antonio Marras. These are some details. Antonio Marras actually is a designer who was born in Sardinia, which is a region in Italy that had all this kind of, you know, rural but important tradition of weaving and textile. So it's quite fascinating. And for him, it sort of reimagined the past, reimagined the folkloric tradition, and subverting it and make it modern, making avant-garde and related to crossing the borders, really. In fact, I am reading a quotation. He wrote a foreword for our first catalog. So Antonio Marras says, "Border can be a limit as well as an opportunity, a line that cuts and divides, but also the place where things meet, a separation, but also a rule with which to come to grips, to know, interpret, understand, absorb." And then, you know, has a beautiful text actually that he wrote for the catalog, because he sent us the pieces. This is a detail. It looks like an abstract painting. This is a detail because what he did in the 90s, he deconstructed a suit that belonged to his uncle who emigrated to America. So a suit that was a men's suit, but then he reimagined completely and is an evening wear, couture. And he painted, so these are some of the stitches. I don't know if you want to go see the skirt yes. So this is it. This is the skirt. So this is just an example of interrogating this notion of borders, tradition. And Marras also is one of the designers very active in fashion revolution in Italy, because he has a space in Milano. And they had, in fact, there is another slide. Sorry, I don't know if I don't control it. Can you go ahead? Yeah, this is another. For example, this is the top, is actually a skirt that belonging to an ethnic group in Sardinia that he completely, and he put it with modernist, very modernist, it looks like a Mondrian painting, the skirt, so reimagining completely. And then, can you go ahead? This is some of the exhibition 2017 I had. Next, please. Next slide. So this is the catalog. Ahead, yes, yes, yeah. Yes, this, for example, is actually another artist, Maria Lai, Sardinian, important artist. That was very important for Antonio Marras because they collaborated. She really was an artist that started with the everyday things, you know, stitching and sewing, repurposing things. She made sculpture with bread. So the everyday, you know, the history of women working with geographies. This is one of her geographies. It looks like a map, but is all, you know, so then you understand also the similarity and the kind of inspirational of this interrogation of the space, you know, what you do with textile, etc. Can you go next? And this is the Spazio Marras in Milano. This is 2017, where Marras had an exhibition because of Fashion Revolution. So there was one including some designers in Italy who are very active, like Cangiari, and you know, another Silvia Giovanardi. Sorry, you know, these are all Italians, but they are very active. Tiziano Guardini, who are very active.
Eugenia, I'm so sorry, you have 1 more minute.
Okay, I'm almost done. And in fact, this is actually in 2018, I was in Rome teaching in La Sapienza in Rome, a course on fashion. And we did the Fashion Revolution event because in Italy, they wanted to open, the designer open their spaces with the students. So we had an event with Tiziano Guardini in Rome, in which he explained all his process, you know, of sourcing, you know, certain textiles and all, you know, and all his work. So to bring, you know, the knowledge of the craft, of the labor, the love of, you know, and how fashion can be powerful in many respects because of the need to collaborate, to create bridges and not walls. And this is my class. You know, we did, you know, fashion is theory, but we did labs as people, you know, students were repurposing things and cutting and sewing, even without any experience. And in the exhibition, we had some of their pieces together with designers, mainly they were Italian designers, the ones that I just mentioned to you, Silvia Giovanardi, Antonio Marras, and this is also another. So if you can go ahead, this is another quote for Marras, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugenia. That's fascinating, and that notion of translating of culture. I mean, it's stuck in my head, and I have there's a lot of questions that are coming out. But I like the way you talked also about the designer, and it's a perfect segue to our next speaker now, Brenda, who is a designer. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about the role of the designer. But before, can you tell us a little bit about your brand? And I know you are Mexican, American, right? So how do you integrate your Mexican heritage into your design?
Yeah, I think like for me, when I think about my work, it's not like so much about integrating like being Mexican into it, but like the idea of not so much ethnicity, but authenticity, because whatever it is that I'm working with has to feel like true to my voice or true to what I want to express. Where I work from is from a place of intention. I think about for a very long time what is it that I want to say, and really, to be honest, that the brand and everything that it has become really came from that place of like asking myself a series of questions like, who are you? What do you want to say? You know, I think the most important question that I had asked myself was, why are you important in this industry? Like, why are you necessary? Why should you be in fashion? And then through those exercises of asking myself simple or not simple, but more direct questions like that, and then also asking myself super abstract questions that were like, if you were a bird, what bird would you be? If you were a color, what color would you be? You know, so that I could get to a place that felt very, very, very real to me. And in this project that you have in front of you in the slide is the sort of the result of all of those questions. And I think the two most important questions to me when I was figuring out, you know, what do I want to say in the world of fashion is like, what is a classic in fashion, which was, you know, a trench coat, a white tee, a pair of jeans, and then what is a classic to you, to Brenda? And the marriage of those two questions is what became this new classics collection. This idea of creating classics that are they are, in my opinion, they are American classics because I am American, right? But they are told through my experience of and how I navigate America, you know. And so the codes that you saw in the slide previously are all jackets and hoodies that are cut from what are traditionally known San Marcos style blankets. They are made from a type of blanket that was started in Aguascalientes, Mexico. A man went to started the San Marcos brand, went to Spain and saw that the Spanish people had this blanket that was unique to them. And he said, I want to go back to Mexico and I want to create a blanket, you know, that represents our people. So he went back to Mexico and he designed all these amazing blankets, and they became a very important part of the culture. And they were specifically used during the winter time. A lot of people did not have heaters, and most of the people that used these blankets are mostly low-income families. It's a great way to stay warm and stay fashionable and have a fashionable home, you know. And those and the love of that blanket carried over to the United States and exists in a lot of immigrant first-generation communities as well. And the idea to make this took a long time from a technical standpoint, but also how do I present this concept and this idea in a way that honors a story? And to me, like that's the most important part when you're touching something that is so closely tied to a culture, even if it is your own, is like doing the research and having all the right intentions and figuring out why am I touching this and why do I want to do something with it, and what is the best way to present this. And for me, I thought so much about what was missing, and it was a mirror of ourselves, you know. And I thought about my own experiences, like, you know, in my world, it's diverse. It's like I have, you know, friends that are Asian. I have a lot of Black friends. I have trans friends, and there's this whole community that exists that I wanted represented through like the lens of this, you know, textile. And I wanted people to see themselves. And so like this image that you see of all of the models to me was like anyone can look at themselves and see themselves in that photo. You know, that was what I was trying to present, which was something that I felt didn't really or is missing in fashion, and that I could help to empower, like, you know, voices that haven't really been heard, and
So-
also for using my own voice in a way that feels loud. You know?
Yeah, I mean, those are beautiful images. And I know that, I mean, I love the way you talked about the right intention, to authenticity and that right intention. So being in the fashion industry, do you see a lot of people, like, do you see a lot of, like, is it hard to have the right intention, and or what are the challenges that you have to go through?
The challenge of having intention is that intention means you take the time. You give yourself time to think about what you're making and what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it is a challenge because the industry is not it's not built for giving you time to do that. So in order to work like that, you have to not be a part of the machine. And if you're not a part of the machine, then you don't get the money that comes from the machine, you know? Like the machine is constantly generating ideas and generating money. And you kind of have to, you have to make a decision whether that's something that you want to be a part of or not. And so there's many challenges, financial ones. There's also the challenge of, because you are a small designer and you're working with limited funds, you know, you don't have the power to protect yourself financially. You can't afford to get a lawyer if somebody steals your idea, you know, which has happened to me, you know. And like in my particular instance with what happened after I launched these pieces, I'm sure you're familiar with the story, was that there was a French designer, Marine Serret, who launched very similar pieces like the ones that I had launched, and they were in every single store, you know. And the way that I saw that was like that a lot of the times what happens is that they want your ideas, but they don't want you. You know, there's a lot of what happens in fashion is that in order for an idea to be accepted, it has to be filtered through a white lens, you know, and it has to be accepted from a person that looks like them, or in order for it to feel like, oh, this is a good idea, you know. And that's been one of the biggest challenges that like communities of color or underrepresented communities are like, we have good ideas and we are innovators and we do amazing things. It's just, we know that we have it. It's just a matter of everybody else coming to that realization, you know, and allowing those communities to have their voice be heard. So
yeah, well, thank you, Brenda, for sharing your story. And I mean, what I get is also that cultural appropriation is another way to lessen the value of minority races. And I read that, and then that's my transition to Darnell, because again, unfortunately, we can talk for hours, but we have a time. So I read a quote from Bell Hooks, the Black feminist scholar, in a 1992 essay that she wrote called "In Eating the Other," and going back to that idea that Eugenia talked about, the idea of otherness. And she says, and I quote, "The commodification of otherness has been so successful because it is offered as a new delight, more intense, more satisfying than normal ways of doing and feeling. Within commodity culture, ethnicity becomes spice, seasonings that can live up the dull dish that is mainstream white culture." There is a lot to unpack in here. Darnell, could you elaborate a little bit on, I know that we talked about that, and elaborate on the different form of appropriation, and yes, is there anything as black and white, or is everything nuanced, and what is the spectrum of appropriation?
Sure, and we can move into the first slide. And I really also want to just kind of take a step back of what Brenda said of this idea that, you know, certain things created, or creativity that's delved in different respective marginalized communities are often, taken or interpreted within that kind of lens of whiteness, in order for it to be kind of disseminated out toward the public, instead of recognizing that marginalized group or marginalized creator for their, ambitions. And I think within that, that kind of builds on that idea of that quote that Bell Hooks, that quote that you read from Bell Hooks' work. But within that, defining cultural appropriation, as you said, that I've looked at it through the lens of more or less of a spectrum, because I think that what we all have to realize is we're human beings, where there's a lot of gray area in between of who we actually are and what we represent because also there's a basis of intention and intentionality within how how cultural appropriation is really interpreted. Next slide. And so, you know, I actually took elements from for this segment from my class that I taught last semester, that I co-taught at FIT for the MFA program in fashion design. It was a course called The Fashion Activists. And so my role there was really kind of to bring a more theoretical basis to a lot of these designers, where, you know, to give them a lot more awareness of inspiration and where they plan to kind of take inspiration from. And so one of the case studies that I used was the Chanel pre-fall 2014, where you see it was the Métier Dots collection that Chanel does typically every season, just to kind of show the extravagance of what fabrics they're into in that current moment. And with that said, we see the presentation of obviously the misappropriation of a lot of indigenous cultures, particularly to the United States, that are native to the Plains region. You see the elements of the bonnets, you see the elements of, you know, the towards the right center, more or less that dress is a reflection of actual dress of the Lakota people. And then also, as I was doing my research, particularly to the different bonnet types, you know, understanding each individual indigenous community had their own bonnets, but to that degree, I think that mainstream media also plays a part in kind of demonizing, obviously, in addition to history and politics and colonialization. They all play this role into kind of reframing how these different accoutrements were worn. So with this particular example, you know, when I talked to my class about, you know, this idea of these bonnets, they were actually, they were obviously formal pieces, but to that degree, they weren't worn in the way that we portray them to be worn, because we see them in depictions of, you know, Native Americans, you know, fighting, for instance, and that actually was not the truth for each individual community. So now to have that kind of romanticized, misappropriated version of what that signifies in our mainstream culture, then seen on the runway, it only further advances this narrative of otherness that I think the previous speakers certainly alluded to and talked about quite well. Next slide. And again, you know, looking at, you know, like the history within this class, I wanted to kind of go as far back as I could of contemporary fashion, and looking at, you know, this idea of taking marginalized communities or colonized communities and reinterpreting or misappropriating various cultures, mixing them together to kind of, in a way, even though the intention might have been to celebrate or signify something that is so special to a particular designer, because obviously you say Laurent and his North African heritage, but even so, he was French. He was of French descent. So it's really kind of all of those different, it's a lot of kind of complicated connotations around this situation. But even though the intention, if you ask Yves Saint Laurent if he was here today, may have been, you know, to celebrate what he understood as the different variety of African cultures that he looked to in terms of his inspirations, the way he executed it may not have been in the best interest of those communities, especially understanding France's history in West Africa. So there's a lot of implications that certainly borderline along the lenses of racism. And so that's where we kind of get into these kind of pitfalls when it comes to cultural appropriation that we have to kind of recognize, but then also understand again that there is a spectrum. Next slide. The next one. And so for me, I kind of go through, I'm not going to go through obviously all these questions because we don't have enough time, but I know this is going to be recorded so you can go back and see it. But these are kind of general questions that I have, that I take in my own kind of process to understand if something is actual cultural appropriation or if it's not. Because again, we have to kind of find that balance of what's inspiration and what's appropriation, because the two aren't necessarily same, even though they are very much close to one another, and can be close to one another depending on the situation. Some of the questions I have, one of the main ones, is the group being appropriated a marginalized community in a given space or time? That has to be taken in consideration because you have the oppressor taking from the oppressed. And so if that's the case, who is being what are the long-term effects of that accoutrement of culture being taken and interpreted? Is it detrimental or is it going to benefit them? Who's winning? What is the financial gain here? That's also another aspect that I'm sure Brenda can obviously she spoke to in the Marine Sarah example that she had. What was the financial transaction here? Because at the end of the day, if the oppressed isn't benefiting in any form, we can kind of qualify something as cultural appropriation. Next slide. And so for me, there's different, I'm actually going to move to the next slide after this. But
2 minutes.
Perfect. And so for me, in the range of appropriation, there's kind of 4 different types that we have. So in the middle, we have, permissive and adoptive, that I based a lot of my information off of. Sorry, I'm going to bring the book up. It's Who Owns Culture by Susan Scafidi, who is the head of the Fashion Law Institute here in New York at Fordham. She wrote that book from a legal perspective, but obviously it's an opinion-based book, but she talks about adoptive and permissive appropriation, where adoptive leans into where the oppressor takes an element of culture from the oppressed and blurs the lines to the point where it's unrecognizable. An example was the Ralph Lauren incident of the Phi Beta Sigma pants that they did, where they integrated the logo, the brand of the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, which is a Black organization here in the United States, and integrated on their pants. Obviously, we know Ralph Lauren as college prep, wear, but they blurred those lines to the point where it was almost unidentifiable. And that's a problem, specifically because you are dismissing the significance of Black fraternities and sororities here in the United States. Permissive appropriation really lends itself to where there's elements of the oppressed culture that they allow to be taken and interpreted to a degree. Like there's a line, for instance, Catholicism. There's usually that kind of fun play where the church really doesn't get hooked on too much elements of being interpreted into fashion, but that there is a line, and there's a line of respect that has to be made and understood if something is permissive or not. Next slide. And then you have cultural misappropriation, which is the complete blatant disrespect of a different culture. And then you have cultural appreciation, which is more or less appreciative appropriation, where you understood and you research that culture, where appreciation happens in a way that culture is not felt disrespected, and that their community is being uplifted by some way or form of that interpretation of the element that's being taken. Next slide. You can go to the next one after that. And so, just to bring the point home, Willie Smith Street Culture, it's an exhibition that we curated at Cooper Hewitt about designer Willie Smith, who's quote unquote the king of streetwear. And a lot of his elements in his collections, next slide actually, spoke to Southeast Asian dress. And for him, that's a prime example of appreciation. If you actually go to our Willie Smith online community archive, it's actually online. And you can see a lot of the articles and elements that we speak about the way Willie Smith interpreted Southeast Asian dress in his collections, but did it in a way that really celebrated the culture. And also he produced in Southeast Asia all of his collections. So within that kind of total frame from process to presentation, he was really kind of uplifting community. And I think that's really kind of a guiding example for contemporary designers can take and contemporary houses can take in order to execute a more appreciative balance to a lot of the misappropriation that has happened since really the total history of fashion. There's a few more slides, but I think we can cut off here.
Thank you so much, Darnell. I mean, yeah,
of course.
Again, if we could, we would talk for hours about that. I have so many posted around me with all the comments on all your presentation. But I want to move on to Manpreet. Hi. Manpreet, in what form do you think, and it's a perfect, again, segue to what Darnell just presented. So in what form do you think appropriation can be a manifestation of colonial power dynamics?
Yeah, and I think that we should just jump into the slides and I can answer that question through those slides. And I just want to get a time check. Do you have a time that you need me to wrap up by?
Ashlyn, Mackenzie, how much time do we still have?
We have 6 minutes before 4. So can I get 10 minutes? Is that reasonable? Yeah, just even it out with all the others. 10, awesome, thank you. Okay, so I want to start off with, I think that, you know, I was snapping as you were speaking, Darnell, because so much of what you were saying, and you know, the 3 S's I think are just a great framework also when thinking about appropriation versus appreciation. But, you know, when we talk about appropriation, we have to recognize that at the end of the day, it comes down to profit and power. Who holds power and who is profiting from the sharing of culture? And I think that's really important for us to get to. So unfortunately, however, that all too often appropriation fashion shows up in the form of the global north essentially stealing techniques, styles, symbols from those living in the global south. And these are often the same communities that were told their culture is not good enough or needs to be rejected for that of their colonizers. So we have to understand that there is always power dynamics at play, and those power dynamics really feed into how appropriation plays out. You know, one of the things that I actually would argue is sometimes there's this understanding that if a designer is producing within that community, that then therefore, you know, they're more on the side of appreciation versus appropriation. And I personally would argue otherwise, because at the end of the day, there is still power at play. The designer holds more power than the makers or the artisans, and there can still be exploitative power structures and pay structures at the end of the day. So I think that we need to recognize that power is top down. And unfortunately, as much as we try to say, well, you know, we're paying fair wages, that is still not, you're still calling the person who is putting the products out into the world the designer, and the person whose culture you are using just the maker. And I would argue that we need to reframe that, and they are actually the designers. It is their culture that you are taking. So we can go to the next slide. And I think this really brings us to this idea that, you know, at the end of the day, as long as there's a power differential within society, there will always be a community that's identity is being co-opted by another community. And we see this, it's not just, you know, it's oftentimes cultural appropriation conversations happen in the form of white designers are white passing designers co-opting the designs and cultures of communities of color, but you can also see that within communities of color. You can see people of color also appropriating the designs and works of people of color. And I think that that's really important to recognize, because even within a country, domestically, there are power structures. And so you will have indigenous groups, like I'm going to use Guatemala as an example. You have indigenous Guatemalan designs that get then appropriated by people who hold more societal power in Guatemala that are not indigenous, and then sell those within the global market. And then we in the global north, we're like, well, this designer is Guatemalan, so it's okay, it's not appropriating. But we have to recognize that it comes back to power. Who holds power? Whose work is being co-opted for profit? And for me, I think that, this idea of appropriation is really built on the idea of cherry picking what you like about another culture and making it your own, which leads to this notion of exotification, right? I'm going to use my own culture. I think that when it comes to cultural appropriation, the people who should be guiding those conversations have to be people from those communities. They are the ones that we should be listening to and having at the decision-making table. So for myself, when I'm thinking about my culture and when I'm thinking about what I see appropriated, I'll see people, when I got married, traditionally in Indian culture, we have henna done. And especially in North Indian culture, we'll get henna done on our hands during our marriage. And I really was struggling with the idea, because I was like, oh, I don't want to go into work and then answer all these questions, and people just want to see my hands, and then they'll put all these notions and place their assumptions about me, my culture, on me. But if a person who doesn't look like me goes and gets henna done at a street fair, they're seen as worldly. They're seen in a very different light than the assumptions that would be placed on me as a woman with brown skin and Indian heritage. And I think we need to notice that is oftentimes, we see this even with language. When we talk about, there's this fantastic article, and I'm actually going to read the quote. There's a fantastic article that came out on the podcast Code Switch, an NPR podcast. And one of the things that the person said was, when white English speakers fold words from another language into their lexicon, they're often seen as cultured and worldly and potentially even funny. But for people of color, it's a totally different game. And I've seen that. And I think that for me, I see this play out all the time. And, I see this play out in my notion of how I even talk when I'm in a professional setting, wanting to make sure that there's no room for anyone to place assumptions based on my cultural identity on me. And we see cultural appropriation play out in fashion. We see it play out in how people live. And I think that that's really important to recognize. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, when we think about power, power plays out in so many different shapes and forms. We have to think about socioeconomic, racial, educational, geographic. Those are all different forms of power. And when we talk about appropriation, it's so important to recognize that, and I think many of the other speakers mentioned this, but oftentimes when we see it play out in fashion, we see it, modern take on traditional design is a very common concept that we've all heard. And for me, I kind of see it as almost a way of saying that traditional designs are not good enough and they need a modern take, which in itself erases historical context. It erases the significance of that community. It erases the identity and the people behind those designs. And so when we take these very sacred traditions, symbols, and art forms, and we co-opt them, Darnell, one of your examples, I was thinking, I'm Punjabi, and in Punjab, we have a traditional embroidery form called fulkari. And last year I was on Instagram and I saw a English designer advertising products that had Fulgari embroidery on them. And she was acknowledging that it was Fulgari. She was, talking about the fact that it's Fulgari, but you have to understand the context. This is someone from a country that colonized and broke Punjab up. And, and we have to understand that context, because that is power. And that is power at the end of the day, and how that context and that nuance is so important when talking about appropriation. And then my final slide, please. So this slide, it's really close right now. And, I think many of you probably know about the shooting that took place last week. And I am Sikh. I belong to the Sikh community. And, I put this slide in thinking I'd be able to keep myself together, so I apologize if I cry. But, this is a few years ago. During the Gucci fashion show, we had models wearing turbans, Sikh turbans. And the turban is an incredibly religious symbol for Sikhs. It is not something that we just take on and off. It's something that is so sacred. It's a ritual. It's part of our identity. And it is part of what has made us the victim of hate crimes for years. It is part of what fuels microaggressions towards my community. And it is part of the reason the person who murdered the people in the FedEx last week targeted those individuals. It was their identity. And to see brands essentially co-opting something that has caused so much harm, that has turned us into victims of hate, essentially, and try to make it a fashion symbol, I think we can all agree is just not okay. And I use this example because I think it's really important for us to recognize that, we can all, I think many will say, like, this is ridiculous. How did this person get away with this? But that's the thing. This happens all the time in appropriation, right? We see this happening all the time. And I think that when we have these conversations about appropriation, that's why it's so important that we recognize the historical context, that we understand culture, and that we create space for understanding that not everything is meant for fashion, and that some things truly are sacred and meant for those communities to hold close to themselves. So I just want to end with that. Thank you.
A beautiful way to end. Thank you, Manpreet, for sharing your thoughts, your presentation. Yeah, I had goosebumps at the end. It's a very beautiful way to wrap up. And I want to say thank you all for being patient. I know we went a little bit 5 minutes for now overboard, but there is so much to talk about. So if the panelists are willing to stay for 10 more minutes, if that's okay, so we can maybe look at the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
Brenda, Darnell, Manpreet, Eugenia.
Absolutely.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Just to see if someone else has a question. I know we received 2 questions already, and to wrap up the discussion. So Zara sent us a quote from James Young in 2010. He claims that an act of representing, so I'm just going to read the question. An act of representing a culture is not an act of appropriating from it. Artists represent their own experiences in their work. In representing their experiences, artists represent that what is already theirs. They do not represent the experiences of anyone else. When artists represent their experiences of other cultures, the insiders are left with their experiences. They are not appropriated. Other cultures fall within the experience of artists. So in representing other cultures, artists do not have to appropriate anyone's experience, even if that were possible. So I guess the idea is to just understand is appropriating a culture an act of representing a culture and not only an act of appropriating it. If anyone wants to jump in.
Well, again, it's a spectrum. It just depends on it's case by case. I don't believe that, we should, I think everyone touched on this, but, it's not a one size fits all approach on every single situation. We have to kind of use your own kind of research. It really comes down to research. Like, what are you looking at? What's going on? And can you make that analysis for yourself and interpret it yourself for what's happening? And in the case of, an artist, I would have to say it again, it's case by case. But to that point, I think even beyond fashion, it's also, I use the analogy of music as well, where an artist might sample another artist's song, or an artist might not give that credit for the sample, like Blurred Lines with Robin Thicke. He took samples from Marvin Gaye's family and they were in a lawsuit about it. So the thing about it is, in that relationship, credit is also comes into play as well. To the point of, dismissing one's culture. If an artist is going to, be inspired by something based off of their experience, I think looking at what research that they do to execute whatever that final product is in order to know if there's cultural appropriation being taken place, but also if that artist recognizes their place in the world, depending on the oppressor relationship, then I think that also should be taken into consideration as well. And then, of course, the issue of profit, who's benefiting from this. So there's different, I think, monikers that we should kind of take in consideration before making that quick assumption that something is or isn't, to that point.
Mhm.
I also want to add that, profit always isn't just financial. And I meant to say this earlier, is profit comes in many
Right.
shapes and forms, right? So we need to stop thinking of profit purely as financial profit. There's also layers of how someone is seen, how their, credibility. Those are all forms of profit. And I think that we have to recognize, I'm not going to use a fashion example. I'm going to use an example of an anti-racism, speaker, right? Like, you take someone who's basically taken the work of many others in the space, repackaged it as their own, and then shares it into the universe. Now they may be making a financial profit, and they're also making credibility profit, right? Like, they're making a name for themselves on the backs of others and others' work. And I think that that's really important to recognize, is profit also comes in many forms, and the nuance and gray is so important when having these conversations, because when we try to put the magnitude of harm that is often caused is very different depending on what we are seeing play out.
Mhm.
And I think we have to recognize magnitudes of harm as well in this.
Yeah. If anyone else has an answer, otherwise, I also want to say that everyone attendees are free to leave. Sorry, I did not mention that earlier, but please stay. We have another question, and I think they're talking about the streetwear on the slide, which I think was Darnell's slide. And they're asking, is streetwear design apparel worn by white cultural appropriation?
So that is it's tricky because, again, we don't have enough time to talk about this, but streetwear is a term that we were kind of delving into during the Willie Smith Street Couture project. So streetwear is just an extrapolation of sportswear. So at the time, sportswear was the common term used, and it still is today. For Willie Smith, he was looking at what he literally saw people wear on the streets of New York City to inspire what he created, because his whole thing was creating basics that you can reinterpret every single season, because in the fashion industry, as we all know, it's all about trends. What's new? How can you reinvent a shirt or a blouse, or, make it more trendy for something else or another? Willie Smith was not about creating trends. He was about creating classics that were inspired by Southeast Asian dress, that were inspired by Western, this kind of idea, the romanticized Western ideology. And even so, I think in today's world, we often associate streetwear with hip hop and the hip hop community. And within that, we came to the conclusion that streetwear, contemporary streetwear, had multiple paths to where it came into our entire lexicon today. It was one path with Willie Smith because he was not involved with the hip hop community. He was the downtown kid. He had friends like Keith Haring that he collaborated with, and he was at area nightclubs. So he was very downtown. And then you had in the 1980s and 90s, the rise of these quote unquote urban labels that were associated to the hip hop culture that also created a blueprint for contemporary streetwear. And they intersected around the 1990s into the thousands. And that's where we have today this kind of element of streetwear going on. And to say that it's appropriated by white people is a tricky conversation because at the end of the day, I think the issue is, particularly as is to Black people, a lot of our creativity gets diminished by the mainstream, not just in fashion, but in every aspect of culture. And so the issue is not being recognized. I don't think the issue is, using and interpreting streetwear for mainstream or luxury fashion or what it is. I think it's the issue of credit. And to Brenda's point, it's okay for it to be seen on a white body or be purported by a white Eurocentric perspective, but to be seen and promoted by Black bodies is something that shakes the world a little bit. So I think that within itself, I think it's a little more nuanced to that answer, that it's not clear cut. It's not necessarily appropriated, but it's just not credited to Black people. And to Manpreet's point, profit is all about credibility as well. So I think that's the issue.
Okay, I'll take one last question from Elizabeth Joy. She writes, some people may view the appropriation of other cultures into the mainstream runways, magazine, etc., as a way that the world is moving towards a melting pot of cultures. But how does this mixing and watering down of cultures actually lead to cultural erasure? And how can we explain this to people who don't see the harm of cultural appropriation? And Brenda, I would love to hear from you.
Sorry. I'm just reading it because I wanted to try to understand it better.
Yes, of course. And my accent is not helping.
No. How does the mixing and watering down of cultures actually lead to cultural erasure? How can we explain this to people who don't see the harm of cultural appropriation? I think it's, well, first, I think that I can only speak for like me as a Mexican American person, but I think when you when you touch something, you have to know what you're doing with it. Like you have to know what your intentions are, because once it goes, you have no control after you launch something, what it becomes, so I think that for my practice, when I make something, I'm creating something that is, at least my intention is always to create something that is new, that is not something that is going to replace something, but it's something that's going to add to the conversation. And I think that to me is the best kind of way to approach something, and that's how you don't sort of erase something, and yeah, I mean, that's the best way that I could explain it is through my own practices. You don't erase it. If you keep what is pure and you create something that is your own and you have your own conversations about it, and it can be like inspired by something, but it can't replace it, and I think, like, for example, with the San Marcos blankets, I didn't use the original San Marcos blankets because to me, those were historical pieces. They were pieces that I felt were important for the community to be able to preserve and to have. And I didn't think it would be right for me to start to produce on these very limited amount of blankets that exist. And I didn't want to see that erased by using that for myself, you know? So I think that's sort of my take on it. In regards to the mixing, I feel like yeah, you can have these conversations, and you can create things, like I mentioned, that touch on this without erasing things in their entirety. Like with the story that we did on the pañuelos, it was, which is this piece here, it was about telling the story of two cultures, but creating an aesthetic that isn't like my intention was never to take from any one of those cultures and to put my name on it. It was, how do I create something that's new and start a conversation about this? And I think that's the best way to do it. That's how you do it, like, respectfully. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think that don't take something that definitely belongs to a culture and then put your name on it. Like, you know, and like learn how to work with things. And I think if you're working from a place where you want to be respectful to that community, then you're holding whatever is in front of you like an egg, you know, and you know the sensitivity that it has.
What is Brenda doing is an act of cultural translation. So the fact that you respect, you interpret is an historical, you know, garment, and the context and the culture around it. And instead of appropriating in the sense, so that's why, you know, this word is dangerous sometimes, you know, because it can kind of be misleading for certain creative acts that some designers do in a responsible way, in a respectful way, and others don't, of course. But, you know, so then you are actually with this intention. I like the word you use, you know, intention, because intention really requires time, requires reflection, requires that if you hear a language that you don't understand immediately, you pay attention and say, okay, what is the story here? And what do I want to do with the story? And create something that is my own, and is not just a repetition, you know, of that old story. And how can I translate those ideas in such a way that there are innovative ideas, and yet, you know, being respectful of otherness, but also your otherness as a designer, because your identity as all these stories and sensibilities. I'm just taking you as an example because I think that's all I want to say.
It makes perfect sense. And it's actually, I wanted to wrap up for a question for all of you, and you kind of answered it. I wanted to ask you, like, what's next for the fashion industry? And are you positive that this change is happening? Because we see those changes happening, we see those conversations, we are having them today. I know Manpreet is super active also in talking about those. So to Eugenia's point, can we design a new language? Do we need to design a new language, or is it like an additional language to the language that we have? So I would like all of you to briefly answer that question, like what's next, and then, you know, and yeah. So we can start. Yeah,
quickly touch upon the previous question. Sorry. I think that it's also important to recognize that the language around a melting pot in itself is very problematic, because it is essentially saying that we want to erase cultural identities and create one homogenous culture. And the term that I prefer using is a mosaic. Which I think has become more of the adapted terminology, because what that means is people can continue to live in their unique identities and come together still. About the idea around cultural erasure, I think that is a very valid question. I don't think that fashion has that much power, but I do think it has the ability to really to really cause and inflict a lot of harm, to the point where it can cause communities to start seeing harm. It's, you know, it's like microaggressions, right? You start seeing them in multiple spaces, and then eventually they compound on each other, and they can create a lot of harm for communities. And I think that that's where we have to recognize there's different levers of harm that are inflicted, and when they come together and compound each other, that's when we see issues like the erasure of cultures and cultural identities. So what needs to change? I think we really need to rethink who is the designer. I mean, if there's one thing that I think that we need to take away, it's rethinking who is the designer, because oftentimes the designers are those, if you are, I'm thinking about in the context of fashion revolution, the fair trade movement, the designers are the people whose culture you are taking designs from. They are the designers. And I think that that narrative really needs to change. And that's one way we can start addressing power and power structures.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very valid point. What is the role of the designer? What responsibility also he has? Eugenia, do you want to add something on that?
Yes, I would like to add two things. I think there are many levels, because the fashion industry is very, very complex and huge. It's a multi-billion, industry. It's one of the most powerful economic force. So I think there are two main things, certainly the languages to change, because there has to be, more studies about, words and how we use certain words in the process. And so then people who work in education, people who are design, it's a collective. It takes a village. It takes, it's not just the design. This field, the designer is not just the only, it's a more of a collective effort. Then regarding the work, who made my clothes, right? The campaign. And so we are, it's important. I watched recently a film made, I think it was a year ago, made in Bangladesh. I don't know if you saw this film. Mm-hmm. I found it quite powerful, because it is a film in which you see how important it is and how difficult it is for some women, especially, women workers in Bangladesh to unionize. Even within the power structure, not only of the West, but their own country, and the paternalistic, the very, the violence that also this woman as a character has to, go through, a husband who wants to dominate her, and all the dangers for her being an activist and bringing, that kind of awareness. So this is, to me, is very important to understand, because I read a very interesting article. Tanjin, I think she's a scholar, she's from Bangladesh originally, and really she analyzes question more in a more complex way, to see that we need to understand that it's not just to approach, she said, a spotlight approach, but to see in a many directional ways, because it's not just, if we also repeat this narrative always, West and the rest, is dangerous. So we need to kind of open up and bring in the contradictions wherever the contradictions are, in order really to weave this tapestry or this mosaic of collaboration, of change, which has to be political change, structural change, not just cosmetic change. So this is, and so we have to push, If we don't push it, the workers themselves also don't push. You really don't, I strongly believe that.
Yes, and we can see that in the evolution or the history of fashion also, right? Brenda, Darnell, would you like to add something?
Well, go ahead, Brenda.
No, you go first.
No, I'm just gonna just say, structural, it really is a structural change that needs to take place. And, just to put a pin on it, I mean, and I've talked about this, because we're looking at this in a museum context as well. I know Vanessa Friedman wrote that interesting article about collections, museum collections recently. And we had a talk at the CSA about this, but, even in a broader sense about the industry, it really had to start with behind the scenes, who is directing fashion and who is controlling fashion. Because even at the designers, we do focus on the designers. In my opinion, sure, we focus on them a lot, a good amount, but also their designs have to be approved by someone. They're not like that. There's other stakeholders involved in an entire organization, big or small. Therefore, the buck has to stop with someone. And therefore, in order to kind of, cross the Rubicon into a better place of where we can kind of finally solve this question of cultural appropriation and appreciation and really kind of get to that place. It has to start with those who are at the top and really kind of restructuring and reframing themselves and really kind of looking within themselves to understand how we got here and admitting to it. And then of course, taking actual actions and steps that are productive for everyone. And that can go from diversifying a workplace, including different ideas at the table, who has a seat at the table, those questions. When those questions are answered, things like the H&M situation wouldn't happen, or things like the Gucci situation wouldn't happen, or the Prada situation, or the Dolce & Gabbana. Like, we can keep going on and on and on. It's about who is pulling the strings. And if they can solve that within themselves and solve the environment around them, then we will, I don't think we would need panels like this any longer. So.
Oh, Brenda, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna, to Darnell's point, like, I think it's bringing, not just solely diversifying and inclusivity, but it's giving people the autonomy to be able to make decisions. And, because there's a lot of conversations going on. And I mean, as I mentioned, like, a lot of the people that I'm friends with, like, are minorities. And when there's a wave of these conversations, that's really all they turn into. And it's just, let's have a talk, like, let's have a conversation about this, but nobody's really being let in the room. And when they are in the room, their voices are not being heard. So that's the most important part, is like, bring people in and help them be a part of the solutions and creating a better industry. Yeah, I think that's next. And for me, like, as a designer, I think one of the questions you'd ask is like what's the role of the designer? And I think it's really important to see yourself as a person first. And I feel like I'd like to think we're moving in that direction, where you're being asked to be a person first and then a designer. And I think that's a much better place to work from. I know that it doesn't make the most business sense, but it definitely helps you move in a way that at least for me, it helps me to feel like whatever small actions that I'm taking are helping to build the world that I want to live in, or to change the industry in the ways that I would like to. So
perfect. Yeah, so I think this is why those important and conversation are so important. And thank you all for staying half an hour now longer. Thanks to all the attendees also. And yeah, I mean, it was totally worth it. And thanks for sharing your stories, your perspective, your research, your finding. Thanks. Yeah, thank you for being authentic. We go back to that. Ashleen, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you all again so much. I am honored to have shared space with all of you. I do want to speak on behalf of Fashion Revolution USA and say that I hope that all of us can continue to engage these ideas into action. So if anyone on the panel, anyone in the audience wants to connect more on how we can use the Fashion Revolution platform to continue to move ideas and conversation into action around a topic such as this, we're an open source movement that belongs to everyone. And so we are all part of this change. And I just want to encourage everyone to continue to stay involved, use the voice, and we're here to be a part of that. And so I'll just wrap up by saying, we have many other events coming up over the next week. So you can find some links in here on other events, takeovers, conversations. We hope that you'll get involved and stay connected with us. And thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you, panelists. And thank you, Joelle, for moderating.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.